When Thomas Brennan signed the inheritance papers for St. Catherine's Chapel, the county clerk's hand trembled slightly as she passed him the deed. The building hadn't held services in 17 years, its stained glass windows cracked like spider webs, its foundations settling into the Missouri clay at angles that defied both geometry and faith. But Thomas wasn't inheriting hope. He was inheriting the last thing his estranged uncle had owned before dying alone in a nursing home 3 counties over, and it came with property taxes he couldn't pay and a roof that leaked in 11 different places. Sometimes desperation looks like providence if you're broke enough to squint. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas stood in the gravel lot of St. Catherine's on a gray October afternoon, his daughter Sophie pressed against his side despite the cold. Both of them staring at the structure that represented their last option before the shelter system. The chapel rose before them like a monument to abandoned faith. White clapboard siding gone gray with age and neglect, a bell tower listing 3 degrees to the east, stone steps leading to double doors that hung crooked on rusted hinges. The cemetery behind the chapel stretched across 2 acres of overgrown grass, headstones tilting like broken teeth, the oldest dating back to 1843 when German settlers had built this place with their own hands and called it sacred. Sophie's small fingers tightened around his. "It looks haunted, Dad." Thomas couldn't argue. Even in daylight, the chapel carried an air of something left behind. Not evil, but sorrowful. The kind of sadness that soaks into wood and stone when prayers go unanswered for too long. That made it perfect. No one else would want it, which meant no one would compete for it, which meant Thomas could actually claim his inheritance without lawyers picking it apart. The math was brutal but simple. The chapel had walls and a mostly intact roof. That made it a palace compared to the alternative, which was his truck cab and whatever rest stop parking lot they could find that wouldn't call the police on a man sleeping with his 9-year-old daughter. Old doesn't mean bad, Thomas said, forcing confidence into his voice that he didn't remotely feel. It means sturdy. These settlers built things to last. We can make it work. Sophie looked up at him with eyes that carried too much understanding for 9 years old. She had developed that look over the past 14 months since her mother Rachel had walked out. No warning, no explanation. Just gone one morning, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that said she couldn't do this anymore. Thomas had been holding Sophie together ever since while his construction work dried up and rent became impossible and every safety net he'd counted on turned to smoke. The county clerk had given Thomas a single iron key, heavy and cold in his palm. It felt like an anchor as he approached the chapel's main entrance. The massive oak doors were warped from weather, their brass handles turned green with age. The key slid into the lock with surprising resistance, and the door groaned open on hinges that hadn't moved in years, revealing the space beyond. The interior hit them with the smell of abandonment. Mildew and rot and something older underneath. Dust thick enough to see in the weak sunlight that filtered through broken stained glass. The sanctuary stretched before them, 20 rows of wooden pews still in place, most of them intact despite the years. The ceiling rose 15 feet overhead, supported by exposed beams that showed water damage and spreading stains. At the far end, the altar platform sat elevated 3 steps above the main floor, and behind it, a massive wooden cross hung crooked on the wall. "Can we really live here?" Sophie asked quietly, her voice small in that echoing space. Thomas surveyed what he'd inherited with what he hoped resembled determination. "We'll make it work. See that side room over there?" He pointed to a door off the sanctuary. That was probably the pastor's office or a classroom. "We'll clean it out real good. Set up our beds. I can get the heat working. Maybe even fix some of the windows. It'll be warmer than the truck." "I miss our apartment," Sophie said softly. The words struck Thomas harder than she probably intended. Sophie used to love adventures. Before Rachel left, before Thomas's steady construction work evaporated when the housing market collapsed, before their life became a series of increasingly desperate compromises, Sophie had been fearless. She had explored job sites with him, built elaborate structures from scrap wood, invented games that could occupy her for hours. Now she flinched at change, clung to routine, looked at the world through eyes that expected disappointment. Thomas knelt to her level, his knees protesting against the dusty floor. "I know things have been hard. I know you didn't ask for any of this. But I promise we're going to be okay. This place might not look like much now, but it's ours. Nobody can evict us. Nobody can raise the rent. We just need to make it livable." Sophie studied his face with that too perceptive gaze. "You promise?" Thomas had learned the weight that promises to children carried. Promises you might not be able to keep. "I promise we'll try our hardest. That's all I've got." Sophie seemed to accept it, nodding slightly before turning her attention back to exploring their strange new home. They spent the remaining daylight hours doing basic reconnaissance. Thomas tested light switches, finding to his relief that electricity still functioned, though several bulbs had burned out long ago. The plumbing proved more complicated. A small bathroom attached to the side office had a toilet that flushed brown water for several long minutes before clearing. The sink worked, though the pipes groaned with protest. Thomas counted it as a victory given his low expectations. The side office would become their living space. It had been used for Sunday school classes, judging by the faded posters still clinging to the walls showing biblical scenes in cheerful colors. Thomas tore them down, swept out mouse droppings and dead leaves, then laid out their sleeping bags on the floor. Their camping stove went in one corner, their food supplies in another. Sophie arranged her stuffed animals on the window ledge with careful precision, creating order in the chaos. "It's like camping," Thomas offered, watching his daughter organize her few possessions. "Camping is supposed to be temporary," Sophie replied without looking up. Thomas had no response to that. Instead he focused on practical tasks. Heat would be their immediate challenge. The chapel had an old furnace in the basement, but Thomas needed to check if it still functioned. For tonight, he had space heaters they could run off the electrical outlets. Tomorrow he would investigate the heating system. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They ate dinner sitting on the floor of their new room. Sandwiches made from gas station supplies Thomas had picked up on the drive into Clearwater, the small town 2 miles down the road. Sophie chewed slowly, her eyes wandering around the bare walls. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, turning the windows into black mirrors that reflected the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. "Tell me about Mom," Sophie said suddenly. The request caught Thomas off guard. Sophie rarely asked about Rachel anymore. The first few months after she left, Sophie had asked constantly. Where did Mom go? Was she coming back? Did she still love them? Thomas had fumbled through explanations that satisfied neither of them, eventually settling on variations of Mom made a choice and some things we can't understand. After a while, Sophie stopped asking. Thomas had thought that meant acceptance. Now he wondered if it had just been retreat. What do you want to know? Thomas asked carefully. Sophie picked at her sandwich. Do you think she would be mad about us living here? Thomas wrestled with this question. Would Rachel be angry that their daughter was sleeping on the floor of an abandoned chapel? Or would she understand that Thomas was doing everything he could with impossible circumstances? He would never know. Rachel was gone and he was left making decisions alone, hoping he wasn't failing their daughter in ways that would mark her forever. Your mom made her choice to leave. That was on her, not us. We're doing what we have to do to stay together and survive. I think that's what matters most. Sophie absorbed this quietly. I just want to feel safe again. The simple statement nearly broke Thomas. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. They finished dinner in comfortable silence. Thomas cleaned up their minimal dishes while Sophie prepared for bed, changing into her pajamas and brushing her teeth in the stark bathroom down the hall. When she returned, Thomas tucked her into her sleeping bag and read to her from one of the books they had brought, a worn copy of The Secret Garden that had been Sophie's favorite before everything changed. Sophie fell asleep halfway through the chapter, her breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of childhood rest. Thomas continued reading softly for a few more minutes, reluctant to stop this small piece of normalcy. Finally he closed the book and simply sat there watching his daughters sleep in their strange new home. The chapel made sounds at night. Wood contracting as temperatures dropped. Wind finding its way through gaps in the walls. Something dripping somewhere deep in the plumbing. Normal sounds for an old building, Thomas told himself, even as they raised the hairs on his neck. He had grown up in suburbs and rental apartments, not abandoned churches. The sheer size of the sanctuary, the echoing spaces, the shadows that pressed against their small island of light, it all felt overwhelming in the darkness. Thomas checked the space heater to make sure it was positioned safely, then settled into his own sleeping bag. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds and the hard floor beneath him. At some point in the early morning hours, exhaustion finally won. He woke to gray Missouri sunlight streaming through dirty windows and Sophie already awake, sitting cross-legged on her sleeping bag and drawing in her sketchbook. Thomas had bought her that sketchbook and a set of colored pencils 6 months ago, back when he still had steady work. Sophie had filled half of it already with detailed drawings of houses and buildings, architectural sketches that showed surprising talent for a 9-year-old. "Morning, kiddo," Thomas said, his voice rough from sleep in the dry air. "Morning," Sophie replied without looking up from her drawing. "This place makes weird sounds at night. Old buildings do that. It's just the wood settling. Temperature changes. Nothing to worry about." Sophie nodded but didn't look convinced. Thomas couldn't blame her. In daylight the chapel looked less menacing but no more welcoming. Just old, vast, and fundamentally empty. Thomas made them a basic breakfast on the camping stove. Instant oatmeal and coffee for himself. As they ate, he outlined his plan for the day. First priority was checking the furnace and heating system. If it could be salvaged, they would have better living conditions. If not, he would need to figure out alternative solutions before winter truly set in. "Can I explore while you work?" Sophie asked. Thomas hesitated. The chapel was large, potentially dangerous with its rotting floorboards and questionable structural integrity. But keeping Sophie confined to one room seemed cruel, and he couldn't watch her constantly while trying to assess the building systems. "You can explore the main sanctuary and the rooms up here," Thomas compromised. "But you stay away from the basement unless I'm with you, and you stay where I can hear you if you call. Deal?" "Deal," Sophie agreed readily. They spent the morning on parallel tasks. Thomas descended to the basement, a dank space accessed by narrow stairs that creaked alarmingly under his weight. The furnace was ancient, a coal-converted unit from the 1950s that someone had retrofitted for natural gas at some point. Thomas knew basic mechanical systems from his construction work, but this antique equipment was beyond his expertise. He would need to call in a specialist, which meant money he didn't have. Meanwhile Sophie's footsteps echoed overhead as she wandered the sanctuary. Occasionally she would call down to Thomas, reporting her discoveries. A closet full of old hymnals. A storage room with dusty choir robes. A small kitchen with cabinets still holding chipped dishes. Thomas was making notes on the heating system, trying to determine what might be salvageable, when Sophie's voice cut through the building with unusual urgency. "Dad. Dad, come quick." Thomas was up those stairs faster than he thought possible, heart hammering. Sophie's tone hadn't been panicked exactly, but something close. He found his daughter standing at the base of the altar platform, staring down at the wooden floor. "What's wrong?" Thomas asked, scanning for danger. "Nothing's wrong," Sophie said, her eyes bright with excitement. "But look at this." She pointed to a section of the altar floor where the wood looked different. Darker, newer somehow. Thomas approached cautiously, examining the boards. They had been replaced at some point, clearly not original to the building. And along one edge, barely visible, was a small brass ring set flush with the wood. "It's a trap door," Sophie whispered. "I was looking at the cross on the wall and I noticed the floor looked weird up here." Thomas knelt down, running his fingers along the edge of the boards. The trapdoor was expertly concealed, designed to blend with the surrounding floor. He gripped the brass ring and pulled. The door lifted with surprising ease, revealing a set of stone steps descending into darkness beneath the altar. "Stay here," Thomas instructed Sophie. He pulled out his phone, activating its flashlight function, and peered down into the space below. Cold air rushed up, carrying a smell of old stone and something else. Something metallic. The steps led down about 8 feet into what appeared to be a hidden chamber. As Thomas descended carefully, his phone light swept across a space roughly 10 feet square. And what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The chamber was filled with wooden crates. Old ones, reinforced with metal bands, stacked carefully along 3 walls. But it was the 4th wall that commanded his attention. There, in a simple wooden frame, hung a large photograph of a man in clerical robes. Elderly, with fierce eyes and a stern expression. Below the photograph, a brass plate bore an inscription. Thomas had to step closer to read it in his phone's limited light. Father Matthias Blackwell, 1891–1962. Shepherd of St. Catherine's. May his works follow him. What is it? Sophie called from above, unable to contain her curiosity. It's a hidden room, Thomas said slowly. I think it belonged to the old priest who ran this chapel. Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs despite his earlier instruction to stay put, her eyes huge as she took in the chamber. Why would a priest hide a room under the altar? It was an excellent question. Thomas had no answer. He moved to the nearest crate, examining it more closely. The wood was old but solid, reinforced with brass corners and a heavy padlock that had rusted shut. He retrieved tools from his truck and broke the lock. Inside, wrapped in oil-treated canvas that had survived decades, were neat stacks of cash. Old bills, denominations from the 1950s and 60s, bundled with rotting rubber bands. Thomas counted quickly. $50,000 in this crate alone. And there were at least 20 more crates stacked against the walls. His hands trembled as he opened another crate. More cash. A third crate. Still more. Along with something else. Documents, sealed in waterproof containers. Old ledgers, carefully preserved. Daddy, Sophie whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. Is that real money? Thomas stared at the currency filling the crates, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Real money, probably millions of dollars worth, hidden beneath an altar in an abandoned chapel he had inherited for nothing more than back taxes and a dead uncle's final spite. Yes, Thomas heard himself say from very far away. I think it is. Thomas spent the next 6 hours locked in that hidden chamber while Sophie sat on the altar steps above, entertaining herself with her sketchbook. The cold bit through his jacket, numbed his fingers, made his breath fog in the air, but he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until he understood what Father Matthias Blackwell had left behind. The chamber contained more than cash. Tucked behind the wooden crates, Thomas found metal file boxes, their contents protected by layers of wax paper and desiccant packets that had kept moisture at bay for decades. Inside were ledgers, meticulously maintained in precise handwriting. Not church records, but something more personal. A confession of sorts, written by a man who clearly trusted no one. The earliest entries dated back to 1945, just after the war ended. Father Matthias had been 43 then, already established at St. Catherine's for nearly a decade. The entries weren't daily journals but periodic recordings of decisions, calculations, and what appeared to be justifications for actions taken. Thomas read slowly, his phone battery draining as he pieced together the story Father Matthias had documented. The priest had come from nothing, an orphan raised in church institutions, ordained young and sent to rural Missouri where no one else wanted to serve. He had arrived at St. Catherine's in 1936 to find a congregation barely surviving the Depression, families losing their farms, children going hungry while banks foreclosed on land that had been worked for generations. Father Matthias had done what the church wouldn't. He had helped them. The ledgers detailed a secret operation spanning 2 decades. Father Matthias had borrowed money from the diocese under false pretenses, claiming repairs and improvements that were never made. He had taken that money and loaned it to struggling families at rates they could actually afford, sometimes at no interest at all. He had saved farms, kept families together, prevented foreclosures that would have destroyed the community. But the church discovered the discrepancies in 1961. An audit revealed missing funds, and Father Matthias faced criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. The families he had saved testified on his behalf, but the diocese wanted an example made. The trial had been scheduled for March 1962. Father Matthias never made it to trial. He died of a heart attack in January, alone in the chapel's rectory, his reputation destroyed, his actions condemned by the institution he had served. The final entry in the ledger was dated 3 days before his death. They call me a thief. Perhaps I am. I took from an institution that hoarded wealth while children starved. I gave to families who needed mercy more than judgment. The church will recover what I borrowed. They always do. But the families I saved, they will remember that someone cared enough to risk everything. Let this record stand as my defense, even if no court will hear it. I hid what remained not from greed, but from fear that the church would reclaim it before it could do any final good. Whoever finds this, may they use it with more wisdom than I possessed, and less regard for institutions that value rules over people. Thomas read those words 3 times, trying to understand the weight of what he had found. Father Matthias hadn't been a criminal. He had been a man who had chosen people over policy, compassion over canon law. And he had died in disgrace because of it. The cash in the crates represented what remained of the borrowed money. Funds Father Matthias had hidden before the audit could seize everything. Thomas counted systematically over those 6 hours, documenting each crate's contents. The total was staggering. $2,870,000. Money that had been hidden for 63 years, waiting for someone to discover it and make a choice about what it meant. Thomas emerged from the chamber to find Sophie had drawn an elaborate picture of the altar and the hidden door, complete with mysterious shadows and detailed architectural elements. She looked up as her father appeared, her expression curious but patient. "Did you find treasure?" Sophie asked. "Maybe," Thomas said. "I found some very old information about the priest who used to run this chapel. I need to think about what it means. Can the money help us?" Sophie's directness cut through any pretense Thomas might have attempted. Thomas sat beside her on the altar steps, his back aching from hours bent over crates in the cold chamber. The money could help them. It could change everything. Pay off debts, secure housing, fund Sophie's education, create the stability Rachel's abandonment had destroyed. But it also came with complications he was only beginning to understand. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Thomas researched inheritance law and property rights on his phone. The legal situation seemed murky. He had inherited the chapel through legitimate means. Assets found on the property should belong to him. But the money had been stolen from the Catholic diocese, even if Father Matthias had used it for noble purposes. The church might have legal claims, though after 63 years, those claims would be complicated by statutes of limitation and the difficulty of proving ownership. His phone rang, startling him in the quiet chapel. Unknown number, local area code. Thomas answered cautiously. "Thomas Brennan?" A man's voice, measured and professional. "My name is Richard Duval. I'm an attorney representing the Blackwell Family Trust. I understand you recently inherited St. Catherine's Chapel." Thomas's stomach dropped. Blackwell. A descendant of Father Matthias, calling him the same day he discovered the hidden chamber. That couldn't be coincidence. "That's right," Thomas said carefully. "How can I help you?" "I'd like to meet with you," Richard said. "Discuss the property, its history. The Blackwell family has some interest in the site's historical preservation, particularly regarding Father Matthias's legacy." Historical preservation. Code for searching for the hidden money. Thomas's mind raced. How had they known to call today? Had someone been watching the chapel? Had they seen him and Sophie exploring? "I'm not looking to sell," Thomas said. "I'm not looking to buy," Richard countered smoothly. Just to talk. I'm in Clearwater tomorrow. Perhaps we could meet at the chapel. Say 10 in the morning? Thomas wanted to refuse, but curiosity won. He wanted to see what Father Matthias's family knew, what they wanted. And maybe, despite everything, he wanted to look them in the eye and decide for himself whether they deserved to know about the wealth their ancestor had deliberately hidden. 10 works, Thomas agreed. After the call ended, Thomas sat in the dark office, listening to Sophie's peaceful breathing and the old chapel's nighttime sounds. Tomorrow would bring complications he wasn't prepared for. A confrontation between blood inheritance and discovered fortune, between what was legal and what might be right. Richard Duval arrived exactly at 10, driving a black sedan that looked aggressively out of place against the chapel's rural decay. He emerged dressed in what Thomas recognized as expensive casual wear. Early 50s, with graying hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Behind him, a woman stepped out of the passenger side. Younger, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back and Father Matthias's fierce eyes staring out from a different face. Sophie watched from the office window as Thomas descended to meet their visitors. He had told his daughter to stay inside during the conversation, a precaution that felt increasingly necessary. "Mr. Brennan," Richard said, extending a hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. This is Margaret Blackwell, Father Matthias's great-niece." Margaret's handshake was firm, her eyes already scanning the chapel's exterior with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. Her gaze lingered on the bell tower, the cemetery beyond, calculating something Thomas couldn't quite read. "You said you wanted to discuss the property's history," Thomas said. Margaret turned her full attention to him. "My great-uncle built something remarkable here. This chapel served this community for over 30 years under his guidance. He was beloved by the families he ministered to, even if the church hierarchy saw things differently. The church thought he was a thief," Thomas said bluntly. Margaret's jaw tightened. The church thought he violated their rules. The families he saved thought he was a saint. Perspective matters. Richard cleared his throat, stepping into the conversation with practiced ease. "Ms. Blackwell has spent years researching her great-uncle's life, trying to clear his name. We've discovered evidence that Father Matthias was far more than the embezzler the diocese made him out to be." "What kind of evidence?" Thomas asked. Margaret pulled out her phone, scrolling through images before handing it to Thomas. The photos showed historical documents, letters from families Father Matthias had helped, testimonials written decades ago defending his actions. The research was extensive, genuine. "My great-uncle died in disgrace," Margaret said quietly. "His funeral was attended by 300 people from this community, but the church refused to let him be buried in consecrated ground. They erased his name from their records, treated him like a criminal instead of a man who sacrificed everything to help people the institution had abandoned." Thomas scrolled through the images, seeing pattern after pattern of families praising Father Matthias's generosity, his willingness to help when no one else would. It aligned with what he had read in the ledgers. "So you want to clear his name," Thomas said. "What does that have to do with me?" Margaret's expression shifted, calculation replacing grief. "There are family stories about Father Matthias. Things he may have left behind that weren't discovered during the church's investigation. Assets he had to protect them from seizure." There it was. Thomas kept his expression neutral. "What kind of assets?" "Money," Margaret said bluntly. Father Matthias borrowed significant sums from the diocese. Only a portion was recovered. Family legend suggests he may have hidden the rest, not for himself but to ensure it eventually went to the community he served rather than back to the institution he felt had failed that community. "And you think it's hidden here," Thomas said. "I know it is," Margaret replied. "My great-uncle left notes, coded references and letters to family members. This chapel was his life. If he had anything, it would be here, on sacred ground where he felt closest to his true calling." Richard stepped forward again. "Mr. Brennan, we're not here to threaten or coerce. We simply want to recover what belongs to Father Matthias's legacy. You purchased the building legally, No one disputes that. But if there are assets hidden here, those represent my client's family inheritance. They should be used to complete the work Father Matthias started. And what work was that? Thomas asked. Helping people, Margaret said simply. My great-uncle spent his life trying to keep families together, save farms, prevent the kind of devastation that happens when institutions prioritize profit over people. I want to continue that work. Create a foundation in his name. Use whatever he left behind to help struggling families in rural communities like this one. That's what he would have wanted. Thomas studied her face, trying to read sincerity from performance. Margaret seemed genuine, her passion for her great-uncle's memory evident. But passion didn't equal rights, and family stories didn't equal legal claims. I haven't found anything, Thomas said. The lie came easier than he expected. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. You've been here less than 2 days. You haven't searched thoroughly. I've searched enough to know this place is exactly what it looks like, Thomas said. An abandoned chapel with a leaking roof and broken windows. If your great-uncle hid millions of dollars here, someone would have found it in 63 years. Maybe, Richard said quietly. Or maybe it took the right person with the right reason to look. The implied threat hung in the air. Thomas felt his temper rising but kept his voice level. I need to get back to making this place livable for my daughter. If you're not here to buy the property, I don't see what else we have to discuss. Margaret pulled a business card from her purse, handing it to Thomas. That's my number. When you find what Father Matthias left behind, and you will find it, call me. We can work something out that honors his legacy and helps your situation. After they departed, Thomas stood in the chapel parking lot, turning Margaret's business card over in his hands. She had been so certain. Not hoping he would find something, but knowing he would. That confidence suggested more than family legend. It suggested specific knowledge, perhaps information from sources Thomas hadn't yet discovered. Sophie emerged from the chapel, having apparently watched the entire conversation from her window perch. Were those people mad? Not mad, Thomas said. Determined. Are they going to take our money? Our money. Sophie had already claimed ownership with the simple logic of childhood. Thomas crouched to his daughter's level, aware of how these next words would shape her understanding of right and wrong. It's complicated, sweetheart. That money belonged to a priest who took it from the church to help people. He died before he could finish what he started. Now his family wants to continue his work. But we found it, Sophie said. And we need it too. Doesn't that matter? Thomas wished morality were that straightforward. Sometimes what we need and what's right aren't the same thing. I have to figure out which matters more. That night, Daniel lay awake long after Sophie had fallen asleep, his mind churning through impossible choices. Father Matthias had written that he hoped whoever found the money would use it with more wisdom than he possessed. But what was wisdom in this situation? Keeping everything for himself and Sophie, ensuring their survival but ignoring the priest's intended legacy? Giving everything to Margaret, honoring Father Matthias's work but abandoning his daughter's security? Or something in between that satisfied no one completely? The next morning brought rain, cold and steady, drumming on the chapel's damaged roof and finding every leak. Thomas spent hours placing buckets and pans to catch the water, each drip a reminder of how much work the building needed, how much money it would take to make it truly livable. He was emptying a bucket in the bathroom when he heard a vehicle approaching. Through the window, he saw not Margaret's sedan but a panel van with a local news station logo on the side. A reporter and cameraman emerged, looking up at the chapel with obvious interest. Thomas met them at the door before they could knock. Can I help you? The reporter, a young woman with styled hair and a microphone, smiled professionally. Hi, I'm Jennifer Torres from KMIZ News. We heard about your inheritance of St. Catherine's Chapel and wanted to do a story about the building's history. Would you be willing to answer a few questions? How did you hear about it? Thomas asked, though he already suspected the answer. We received a tip from someone interested in the chapel's historical preservation, Jennifer said. They mentioned Father Matthias Blackwell's legacy and suggested this would be a compelling human interest story. Margaret. She had gone to the media, applying public pressure to force Thomas's hand. If he found anything now, it would be under scrutiny. And if he didn't cooperate with her plans for a foundation, he would look like someone trying to steal from a saint's legacy. "I'm not interested in being on the news," Thomas said firmly. "This is private property." Jennifer's smile didn't falter. "We could film from the public road, show the exterior. But a personal angle would make the story much more compelling. A single father trying to renovate a historic chapel, honoring Father Matthias's memory while building a home for his daughter. That's an inspiring narrative." The trap was elegant. Refuse and look like he was hiding something. Cooperate and have his every move documented, making it impossible to quietly use Father Matthias's hidden money without questions about where it came from. "I need time to think about it," Thomas said. "Give me your card. I'll call if I decide to participate." After they left, Thomas called Margaret's number. She answered on the first ring. "You called the news," Thomas said without preamble. "I called a reporter I know who specializes in historical preservation stories," Margaret corrected. "Father Matthias deserves recognition for what he did. This community deserves to know the truth about a man they loved and the church destroyed." "You're trying to force my hand," Thomas said. "Make it impossible for me to keep anything I find without looking like a thief." "I'm trying to ensure my great-uncle's legacy is honored properly," Margaret replied. "If you found nothing, as you claim, then the news story won't affect you at all. It'll just bring attention to an abandoned chapel and a man who died trying to help people. But if you have found something, Thomas, and you're planning to keep it all for yourself, then yes, I'm making that choice harder for you. Because that money wasn't earned by you. It was sacrificed by a man who gave up everything for this community." "Your great-uncle stole it," Thomas said flatly. "My great-uncle redistributed it," Margaret countered. "There's a difference. The church had millions while families starved. He simply moved resources from those who didn't need them to those who did. That's not theft. That's justice." Thomas wanted to argue, but part of him agreed with her. The ledgers had shown a man trying to save lives with the only tools he had, even if those tools violated every rule he was supposed to follow. Father Matthias hadn't kept the money for himself. He had died broke and disgraced, defending families who couldn't defend themselves. "I need time," Thomas said finally. "To think about all of this." "Time is expensive," Margaret replied. "Every day you delay is another day that money sits unused while people struggle. How many families could be helped right now with what Father Matthias left behind? How many farms saved? How many children fed? Your comfort isn't worth their suffering, Thomas." She ended the call before he could respond. Thomas stood in the leaking sanctuary, rain drumming overhead, buckets filling with water, and felt the weight of a decision he hadn't asked for. He had inherited not just a building but a moral dilemma wrapped in 63 years of hidden history, a priest's failed redemption, and a great-niece's righteous crusade. Sophie appeared from the office, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. "Dad," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about the money." "Yeah?" Thomas knelt to her level. "That priest, he helped people like us, right? People who didn't have anywhere else to go?" Thomas nodded. "That's what his notes say. He helped families keep their farms, stay together when everything was falling apart." Sophie's expression was serious, older than her 9 years. "Then maybe we should help people too. Not give it all away, because we need some to fix this place and be okay. But maybe some of it should do what he wanted." Out of the mouths of children came wisdom Thomas hadn't been able to find himself. His daughter had cut through all the legal complexity, all the moral ambiguity, and found something simple and true. They needed help. Other people needed help. Maybe the answer wasn't choosing sides but finding balance. That evening, Thomas descended into the hidden chamber one final time. He stood before Father Matthias's photograph, meeting those painted eyes that seemed to judge him across decades. "I don't know if I'm doing this right," Thomas said quietly. Your great-niece wants everything for a foundation. I need enough to survive and fix this place. Maybe the answer is somewhere in between. Maybe that's what wisdom looks like, trying to honor what you wanted while also taking care of my daughter. The photograph offered no response, but Thomas hadn't expected one. He made his decision standing in that cold chamber surrounded by crates of money that represented both salvation and burden. Tomorrow he would call Margaret. Tomorrow they would negotiate. Tomorrow he would try to build something that honored a dead priest's sacrifice while also securing his daughter's future. But tonight, he simply stood in the presence of Father Matthias Blackwell's legacy, understanding that some choices weren't about right versus wrong. They were about finding the least wrong path through impossible circumstances and hoping that was enough. Thomas called Margaret at dawn, before he could talk himself out of it. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the early hour. "I found it," Thomas said without preamble. "All of it. But we need to talk about terms." They met at the chapel that afternoon. Margaret arrived with Richard, both of them carrying briefcases and expressions that tried to mask desperation with professional composure. Thomas had Sophie stay in the office, but he knew she was watching from the window, her sketchbook forgotten in her lap. He led them to the altar, lifted the trap door, and watched their faces as they descended into Father Matthias's hidden chamber. Margaret moved slowly through the space, her fingers trailing along the wooden crates, her eyes filling with tears when she saw her great-uncle's photograph hanging on the wall. "He kept his promise," she whispered. "He protected what he could so it would eventually do good." Richard was already calculating, his lawyer's mind assessing value and strategy. "Mr. Brennan, given the circumstances, we believe the appropriate course is for you to transfer these assets to the Blackwell Family Trust. In exchange, we can offer you compensation for your cooperation. Say $50,000, enough to relocate and establish yourself elsewhere." Thomas had expected this opening gambit. He shook his head. "That's not how this works. I'm keeping half. $1,435,000. The other half goes to your foundation, to be used exactly how Father Matthias intended, helping struggling families in rural communities." Margaret turned sharply. "Half? This is my great-uncle's legacy. And I found it in property I legally own," Thomas said evenly. "I could keep everything and you'd have no legal recourse. I'm offering you more than $1 million to complete Father Matthias's work. That's generous, not theft." Richard started to object, but Margaret raised her hand, silencing him. She studied Thomas with those fierce Blackwell eyes, the same eyes that stared from the photograph behind her. "Why half? Why not just keep it all?" "Because my daughter reminded me that your great-uncle helped people like us," Thomas said. "People with nowhere else to go. If I take everything, I become exactly what he fought against. Someone who hoards resources while others suffer. But I'm not giving you everything either, because Sophie deserves stability and I deserve a chance to build something for her. Half honors both needs." The chamber fell silent except for the distant drip of water from the chapel's leaking roof. Margaret looked at her great-uncle's photograph, then back at Thomas. "He would have approved of you," she said quietly. Father Matthias believed in practical compassion, not grand gestures. He would have understood that you need to care for your daughter while also helping others. "So we have a deal?" Thomas asked. "We have a deal," Margaret confirmed. They worked out the logistics over the next 3 weeks, with Richard drawing up agreements that protected both parties while remaining deliberately vague about the money's origins. The story they agreed upon was that Father Matthias had left assets in trust with instructions for their eventual use, discovered through documents found during the chapel's renovation. Not quite true, but close enough to avoid criminal complications. The cash posed unique challenges. They couldn't simply deposit nearly $3 million without triggering investigations. Richard connected them with financial specialists who could convert the old currency into modern accounts through carefully structured estate settlements. It took time and cost them roughly 15% in fees and taxes, but it kept them clear of money laundering charges. Thomas received his share in increments over 2 months. $1,217,000 after all fees and taxes, deposited into accounts he opened with a bank in Colombia, far enough from Clearwater to avoid local gossip. It was more money than he had earned in his entire life, and he felt its weight like a physical thing. He started with the chapel's immediate needs. A new roof, professionally installed, cost $38,000. Updated electrical systems, another $20,000. Plumbing repairs, $12,000. Windows, insulation, heating system overhaul. The practical necessities added up quickly, but Thomas made each decision carefully, investing in quality work that would last decades. Sophie watched the transformation with wide eyes. Workers arrived daily, skilled craftsmen who treated the old building with respect, understanding they were restoring something that mattered beyond its monetary value. The chapel began to look less abandoned and more purposeful, its bones strong beneath the new skin. But Thomas didn't stop at basic repairs. He hired an architect from St. Louis, a woman named Claire who specialized in adaptive reuse of historic buildings. Together they designed a plan that preserved the chapel's character while making it genuinely livable. The sanctuary would remain largely intact, but the back rooms would become proper living quarters, a real apartment with kitchen, bathroom, bedrooms. The basement, once dank and dangerous, would become workshop space. The renovation took 8 months. Thomas did much of the work himself, his construction background proving invaluable. Sophie helped where she could, learning to use tools, understanding through physical labor what it meant to build something lasting. They lived in a rented house in Clearwater during the major work, but visited the chapel daily, watching it transform from ruin to refuge. Margaret, meanwhile, established the Father Matthias Blackwell Foundation with her share of the inheritance. She worked with Richard to create a structure focused specifically on helping struggling families in rural Missouri keep their land. Low-interest loans for farmers facing foreclosure. Grants for necessary repairs and equipment. Emergency funds for medical crises that threaten family stability. Everything Father Matthias had tried to do informally, the foundation would do with legal structure and sustainable planning. The foundation's first recipient was a dairy farm family in Miller County, 3 generations working 200 acres, facing bankruptcy after their barn burned and insurance fell short. The foundation provided $40,000 to rebuild. The second recipient was a widow in Camden County trying to keep her late husband's orchard operating while raising 2 children alone. The foundation covered her property taxes for 5 years, giving her breathing room to make the operation profitable. Word spread slowly through rural Missouri's interconnected communities. Families who had given up hope started calling the foundation's phone line. Margaret and a small staff reviewed each case personally, maintaining Father Matthias's philosophy that institutional rigidity helped no one. Some requests they approved in days. Others required investigation. But they approached each with the assumption that people deserved help, not judgment. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the foundation after 6 months. The article mentioned Father Matthias's controversial history but framed it as a man ahead of his time, someone who had understood that true ministry meant practical action, not empty prayers. The reporter interviewed families the foundation had helped, people who spoke about second chances and the difference between surviving and living. Thomas read the article sitting in the chapel's renovated sanctuary, now warm and dry, its stained glass windows repaired so light streamed through in colors. Sophie sat beside him, no longer a frightened 9-year-old but a 10-year-old growing into confidence. She attended a good school in Clearwater now, thriving in an environment that didn't change every few months. She had friends, routines, stability. "That's the lady who wanted the money," Sophie said, pointing to Margaret's photograph in the newspaper. "She's helping a lot of people." "She is," Thomas agreed. "That's what the money was supposed to do all along." "But we needed help too," Sophie said. "It's okay that we kept some, right?" Thomas pulled her close. "It's okay that we kept some. We're helping in our own way." And they were. As the chapel's renovation neared completion, Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. He converted part of the sanctuary into a community space, free for local groups to use. A food bank operated there twice a week. AA meetings gathered on Tuesday evenings. A homeschool cooperative used the rooms for classes. The chapel became what it had always been meant to be, a place serving people who needed it. Claire, the architect, suggested Thomas apply for historic preservation grants, given the building's age and significance. With Margaret's help providing documentation about Father Matthias's tenure, they secured state funding that covered additional restoration costs. The bell tower was stabilized and the original bell, silent for decades, rang again on Christmas Eve, its sound carrying across Clearwater's cold fields. The cemetery behind the chapel had been part of Thomas's inheritance, 2 acres of tilted headstones and forgotten graves. He spent months that first year researching the families buried there, cleaning stones, documenting names. Sophie helped, learning local history through the weathered inscriptions. They discovered that many of the graves belonged to families Father Matthias had helped during his ministry, people who had loved him despite the church's condemnation. Thomas found Father Matthias's grave in the cemetery's far corner, deliberately isolated from consecrated ground, marked only by a simple stone bearing his name and dates. Someone had planted wildflowers there years ago, and they had reseeded themselves, returning each spring in defiant blooms. On the first anniversary of discovering the hidden chamber, Thomas stood at that grave with Sophie beside him. He had brought a new headstone, properly engraved, commissioned from a craftsman in Jefferson City. It read, Father Matthias Blackwell, 1891–1962, shepherd, servant, saint to those who needed one. Margaret attended the installation, along with 3 elderly residents of Clearwater who remembered Father Matthias from their childhood. They told stories of a man who had visited their families during the hardest years, bringing not just money but genuine care. He had sat at kitchen tables and listened to their parents' fears. He had prayed with them, yes, but also brought groceries, paid electric bills, convinced banks to extend deadlines. He saved my family's farm, one old man said, his voice rough with emotion. My father was ready to walk away from land we'd worked for 3 generations. Father Matthias gave him a loan at no interest, told him to pay it back when he could. We never did pay it all back. Father Matthias died before we finished. I've carried that guilt my whole life. Margaret took the old man's hand. He would have forgiven it, she said gently. That was the whole point. He cared more about keeping your family together than getting his money back. The old man wept, and others joined him, releasing grief they had carried for 60 years. Father Matthias had died thinking himself a failure, condemned by the institution he served, his legacy erased. But here were people who had never forgotten, who had passed his kindness down through generations like an inheritance more valuable than money. Thomas understood then what Father Matthias's hidden chamber had really contained. Not just cash, but a test. Not of worthiness through blood or legal rights, but of character through choice. What would someone do with unexpected wealth? Hoard it? Use it selfishly? Or recognize that resources carried responsibilities to something beyond personal comfort? Time moved across the chapel like seasons, each year leaving its mark in ways both visible and subtle. Sophie turned 11, then 12, growing tall and serious, her sketchbooks filled with architectural drawings of buildings she imagined creating someday. She talked about studying design in college, about creating spaces that served communities. Thomas recognized Father Matthias's influence in his daughter's dreams, the understanding that buildings were more than structures. They were possibilities made solid. The foundation expanded, helping over 200 families in its first 3 years. Margaret published a book about Father Matthias's life, using the ledgers Thomas had found to document the full scope of his uncle's unofficial ministry. The book was picked up by a university press and became required reading in several seminaries, sparking debates about institutional authority versus practical compassion. Some church officials condemned Margaret's work, claiming it celebrated criminal behavior. But more priests and ministers reached out privately, thanking her for telling a story they recognized from their own struggles. The conflict between policy and people was eternal, and Father Matthias had simply chosen a side with full knowledge of the cost. Thomas kept working, taking renovation projects around the county, building a reputation for quality craftsmanship and honest dealing. He didn't need the income anymore, not really, but he needed the work. The act of building things, of taking broken structures and making them whole, gave him purpose beyond simply surviving. He thought about Rachel sometimes, wondered where she had gone and whether she ever thought about Sophie. The anger had faded over the years, replaced by something closer to pity. Rachel had run from difficulty while Thomas had learned to face it. The choice didn't make him better than her, just different. Some people broke under pressure. Others found strength they didn't know they had. On a warm May evening in the chapel's 4th year under his stewardship, Thomas stood in the sanctuary watching Sophie practice piano on an old upright they had restored. She was playing something by Bach, her fingers finding the keys with increasing confidence. The music filled the space, echoing off walls that had heard so many voices over so many years, prayers and hymns and confessions, and now a 12-year-old girl learning discipline through repetition. Margaret sat in one of the pews, visiting for the Foundation's annual meeting which they now held at the chapel. She listened to Sophie play with a slight smile, her great-uncle's fierce expression softened by time and accomplishment. He would have loved hearing music here again, Margaret said quietly. Father Matthias loved Bach, believed music was prayer that didn't need words. Thomas sat beside her. Does it bother you that I kept half? He asked. He had never directly asked, had simply moved forward with their agreement. But the question had lingered like smoke. Margaret considered this thoughtfully. Honestly? At first, yes. I wanted everything for the Foundation, believed that was what Father Matthias would have wanted. But I've watched what you've done here, how you've opened this space to the community, how you're raising Sophie to understand that security means responsibility to others. You're living his values even if you're not giving away every dollar. That matters more than the money. She paused, listening to Sophie transition into a new piece. Besides, if you had given me everything, you and Sophie would still be struggling. Father Matthias didn't help families so they could barely survive. He helped them so they could thrive and then help others. You're doing that. The chapel is doing that. It's not the legacy I imagined, but it's the legacy he would have chosen. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until it released. He had spent 4 years wondering if he had made the right choice, if keeping half made him selfish or practical or something in between. Margaret's words didn't erase the doubt completely, but they softened it. Sometimes right and wrong weren't absolute positions but points on a spectrum, and wisdom meant finding your place on that line and living with it. Sophie finished playing and turned to face them, her expression seeking approval. That was beautiful, Thomas said, and meant it. The Foundation meeting the next day brought together people whose lives had been changed by Father Matthias's hidden legacy. Farmers who still worked their land because emergency loans had prevented foreclosure. A widow who had kept her late husband's vineyard operating through crisis funding. A young family who had received housing assistance during medical bankruptcy. They shared stories not of charity received but of dignity preserved, the difference between help that demanded gratitude and help that recognized shared humanity. One man stood during the testimonial section, older, with weathered hands and a face that had seen hard seasons. My name is Frank Morrison, he said. My grandfather worked his whole life farming bottomland along the Osage River. Father Matthias helped him keep that land during the 50s when floods almost destroyed us. I'm still farming that land today, and my son will farm it after me. 3 generations of Morrisons working the same soil because one priest cared enough to break rules that needed breaking. He turned to face Thomas directly. I heard you're the man who found Father Matthias's legacy and chose to share it instead of keeping it all. I want to thank you for that. You could have taken everything and nobody would have known different. But you chose right, and because of that, families like mine are still working land that means something. Thomas felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected recognition, hadn't wanted it. But hearing this man acknowledge that the choice had mattered, that it had created tangible good beyond his own survival, carried weight he hadn't anticipated. After the meeting, as people filtered out into the spring evening, Thomas walked alone through the cemetery to Father Matthias's grave. The wildflowers were blooming, pink and yellow and white, nature's recurring testimony to a life that had mattered despite institutional condemnation. He thought about the ledgers still stored in his office, the careful documentation of every family helped, every loan extended, every crisis navigated. Father Matthias had known he might face judgment for his actions, had prepared his defense even knowing the church wouldn't hear it. But the real judgment had come from the families he saved, and they had ruled him innocent in the only court that mattered. Thomas knelt beside the grave, pulling a few weeds from around the headstone. "We did okay with what you left us," he said quietly. "Sophie's thriving. The foundation is helping people just like you did. The chapel is alive again, serving the community. I kept half, and I'm not apologizing for that, but I think you would understand. You helped people so they could help themselves, and that's what I'm trying to do." The evening wind moved through the cemetery, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and Missouri soil, earth that remembered every person who had worked it, every family that had struggled with it, every generation that had passed it forward with hope and burden combined. Thomas returned to the chapel as darkness settled, its windows glowing warm against the night. Inside, Sophie was setting the table for dinner, a simple routine that had taken 4 years to feel normal. They ate together in their apartment, talking about school and foundation business and a house sparrow that had built a nest in the bell tower. After Sophie went to bed, Thomas stood in the sanctuary one final time that evening, looking at the space they had saved and transformed. The pews Father Matthias had preached from were still here, refinished but original. The altar where Thomas had found the hidden chamber remained, though the trap door was now sealed, its secret revealed and resolved. The stained glass windows cast no light at night, but Thomas could imagine the colors they would bring at dawn. He thought about legacy, that word people used when they wanted to make temporal things sound eternal. Buildings crumbled eventually. Money got spent. Names faded from memory. But the choices people made, the kindness they showed, the help they offered when help was needed, those things rippled forward in ways no one could fully trace. Father Matthias had died believing he failed, not knowing his hidden chamber would be found by someone desperate enough to understand that sometimes rules needed breaking and sometimes half was better than all or nothing. Thomas locked the chapel's doors and climbed the stairs to his apartment where Sophie slept peacefully, her sketchbook on the bedside table filled with drawings of buildings not yet built. Tomorrow she would wake and go to school and come home to stability that had once seemed impossible. Tomorrow the foundation would help another family keep their farm. Tomorrow the chapel would host the food bank and the homeschool cooperative and all the small gatherings that made community real. Tomorrow would be ordinary, and that was the whole point. Father Matthias hadn't died for grand dramatic gestures. He had died trying to make ordinary life possible for people who could no longer afford it. Thomas had continued that work in his own way, with his own compromises, finding his own place on the spectrum between self-interest and sacrifice. The Missouri night pressed close to the chapel windows, vast and star-filled. Somewhere in the darkness, fields waited for spring planting. Somewhere families lay awake worrying about money. Somewhere children dreamed of futures that seemed out of reach. And in a renovated chapel built by German settlers nearly 200 years ago, a single father and his daughters slept in safety earned through discovered wealth and difficult choices and one priest's faith that eventually someone worthy would come along. The land remembered everything. Father Matthias's bones rested in soil he had served, surrounded by people who had loved him despite scandal. The chapel stood solid on its foundation, its purpose renewed through use. The money he had hidden had finally done the work he intended, just 60 years later than planned and through hands he could never have predicted. Legacy wasn't something you built intentionally, Thomas understood finally. It was what remained after you made the best choices you could with impossible situations, hoping that someone later would understand and maybe continue what you started. Father Matthias had started something. Thomas had continued it. Sophie would carry it forward in ways neither of them could imagine. And that was enough. That was everything. 7 years moved across Missouri like slow water, changing everything gradually until the past felt like a story someone else had lived. Sophie turned 19 in the spring of that 7th year, no longer the frightened child who had discovered a hidden chamber but a young woman who carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that security was built through choices, not luck. She had deferred her acceptance to Washington University's architecture program, not because she couldn't handle it, but because she wanted one more year at the chapel. One more year helping Thomas with the foundation's expansion, one more year watching families transform through help that came without judgment, one more year understanding the weight of Father Matthias's legacy before she stepped into her own future. The chapel had become something beyond what Thomas had imagined that first desperate October when he signed the inheritance papers. It was still their home, yes, but it had evolved into a community center that served Clearwater and 3 surrounding counties. The sanctuary hosted everything from grief counseling groups to agricultural workshops. The basement Thomas had converted into workspace now housed a tool library where farmers could borrow equipment they couldn't afford to buy. The cemetery had become a historical site, maintained by volunteers who understood that remembering the dead meant honoring how they lived. Margaret visited monthly now, the foundation's work requiring constant coordination. She was 51, her dark hair showing gray, but her great-uncle's fierce determination remained undimmed. The foundation had helped over 800 families in 7 years, preventing foreclosures, funding emergencies, keeping people on land their grandparents had worked. The stories accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of lives changed through resources deployed with compassion instead of bureaucracy. On a warm June morning, Thomas stood in the cemetery pulling weeds from around headstones. It was work he did by hand, refusing to use chemicals that might damage the old stones. His back ached more than it used to. 41 years old now, his body showing the accumulated damage of construction work and renovation projects and the simple passage of time. But the work felt meditative, connecting him to the generations buried here, people who had struggled with similar burdens and found their own imperfect solutions. Sophie found him there mid-morning, carrying 2 mason jars of sweet tea beaded with condensation. She sat beside him on the grass, both of them looking out over the cemetery toward the chapel beyond. The building looked solid now, properly maintained, its white clapboard fresh, its bell tower straight, its windows catching sunlight and repaired stained glass. "I've been thinking about Mom," Sophie said suddenly. Thomas took the tea she offered, giving himself time to formulate a response. Rachel was a subject they rarely discussed, her absence so complete it felt archaeological rather than recent. What about her? Whether she ever thinks about us. Whether she knows what we built here. Sophie's voice carried curiosity more than pain, the wound healed enough to examine without bleeding. Thomas considered his answer carefully. "I don't know what your mother thinks, if she thinks about us at all. But I know this. We built something that matters. Whether Rachel sees it or not doesn't change what it is. Do you ever wish she had stayed?" Sophie asked. The honest answer surprised Thomas when he found it. No. Not anymore. If Rachel had stayed, we might never have ended up here. We might have kept struggling in that apartment, kept compromising, kept shrinking our lives to fit shrinking resources. Finding this place, finding Father Matthias's legacy, it required being desperate enough to see possibility in abandonment. Rachel's leaving broke us in ways that let us rebuild into something stronger. Sophie absorbed this quietly. I think Father Matthias would have understood that. Breaking rules, breaking families, breaking open what looked solid to find what was actually valuable underneath. They sat together in comfortable silence, father and daughter who had survived abandonment and poverty and the weight of impossible choices, emerging not unmarked but unbroken. The cemetery grass moved in the breeze, and somewhere across the fields, a tractor worked ground that had been worked for generations, continuing cycles that predated everyone living and would continue after everyone died. That evening brought unexpected visitors. A truck pulled into the chapel parking lot, dusty and road-worn, and an elderly couple emerged slowly. The man was easily 80, moving with careful deliberation. The woman matched his age, her face deeply lined but her eyes sharp. Thomas met them at the chapel door, Sophie beside him. Can I help you? The old man extended a trembling hand. My name is Robert Fisher. This is my wife, Marie. We drove here from Herman. We heard about what you've done with St. Catherine's, and we needed to see it. Thomas shook hands with both of them, noting the emotion barely contained beneath Robert's formal courtesy. "Please, come in." He led them into the sanctuary, and Robert stopped just inside the door, his breath catching. Marie gripped his arm, her own eyes filling with tears. Both of them stared at the space like people seeing something they had thought lost forever. "My father was Michael Fisher," Robert said quietly. "Father Matthias saved our farm in 1954. We were 3 months from foreclosure. The bank was coming to auction our equipment. My father was talking about ending it, couldn't see a way forward. Then Father Matthias showed up at our door with a loan at no interest, told my father the only payment required was keeping the farm working and the family together." Marie spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "My family received help too. Different year, same crisis. Father Matthias gave my parents money for medical bills when my brother got sick. Told them to pay it back whenever they could, and if they couldn't, to help someone else someday." Robert turned to face Thomas directly. "We heard about the foundation, about the money that was found and how you chose to share it. We wanted to see this place again, to see that Father Matthias's work is continuing. We wanted to say thank you to whoever made that choice." Thomas felt the weight of that gratitude like a physical thing. "I didn't do it alone. His great-niece runs the foundation. I just found what he left behind and tried to honor what he intended." "But you chose to share," Marie said firmly. "You could have kept it all. Nobody would have blamed you, not legally. But you chose to help others. That's what Father Matthias taught. That having enough means helping others get enough too." They spent an hour showing Robert and Marie the renovated chapel, explaining the community programs, the tool library, the foundation's work. The old couple listened with expressions that moved between grief and joy, mourning a man long dead while celebrating that his work had survived him. Before leaving, Robert asked to see Father Matthias's grave. Thomas led them through the cemetery to the plot marked with the headstone Margaret had commissioned. Robert and Marie stood there in silence for several long minutes, and then Robert pulled a small leather journal from his jacket pocket. "My father kept records," Robert said. "Every family Father Matthias helped, every loan extended, every kindness shown. He wanted someone to know the truth, even if the church never acknowledged it. He passed this journal to me before he died, made me promise to keep the record. I've carried it for 40 years, not knowing what to do with it." He handed the journal to Thomas. "I think it belongs here now. With someone who understands what it means." Thomas accepted the journal with reverence, understanding that he was receiving testimony, evidence of a life that had mattered despite condemnation. He opened it carefully, seeing names listed in careful handwriting, dates, amounts, brief notes about circumstances. It was comprehensive, damning, and beautiful. Proof that Father Matthias had helped over 200 families during his ministry, far more than the church's official investigation had ever discovered. "Margaret would need to see this," Thomas said quietly. "This changes the historical record." "That's why I'm giving it to you," Robert replied. "So the truth survives. So people remember him correctly." After Robert and Marie departed, Thomas sat in the sanctuary with the journal open on his lap, reading through testimonies written by people long dead, families long scattered. The pattern was consistent. Crisis, help given without judgment, lives rebuilt through temporary support that created permanent change. Father Matthias hadn't saved people. He had given them tools to save themselves, the difference between charity that created dependence and help that enabled dignity. Sophie read over his shoulder, her architect's eye noting the careful organization, the systematic documentation. "He knew he was breaking rules," she said. "He kept records in case anyone ever wanted to see the truth." "He knew he was doing right," Thomas corrected gently. "The records were evidence of that, not defense. He didn't need to defend helping people. He needed to document it so someone would remember." Margaret arrived 2 days later, summoned by Thomas's call about the Fisher Journal. She spent hours reading through it, cross-referencing it with the ledgers they had found in the hidden chamber. The stories aligned perfectly, each document confirming the other's truth. By evening, she sat in the sanctuary with tears streaming down her face. 800 families, she whispered. He helped over 800 families during his ministry. The church accused him of embezzling $60,000, but this shows he redistributed over $200,000, money he borrowed and begged and scraped together from every source he could access. He bankrupted himself helping others, and they called him a criminal. Thomas sat beside her. Will you include this in a second edition of your book? Margaret nodded slowly. The truth deserves to be complete. Father Matthias deserves to be remembered accurately. But more than that, these families deserve recognition. Their struggles, their survival, their gratitude. This isn't just his story anymore. It's theirs. The second edition of Margaret's book was published the following spring, incorporating the Fisher Journal and additional testimonies from descendants of families Father Matthias had helped. The book sparked renewed interest in his story, leading to a formal review by the diocese. After months of deliberation, the church issued a statement acknowledging that Father Matthias's actions, while technically violations of policy, had been motivated by genuine pastoral care. It wasn't full exoneration, but it was recognition. His name was restored to church records. His ministry was acknowledged as complicated rather than criminal. Sophie was accepted to Washington University for the fall semester, finally ready to begin her architecture studies. Thomas helped her pack, loading boxes into a truck for the drive to St. Louis. The apartment felt emptier as her possessions disappeared, each removed item emphasizing how much space one person could occupy. The night before she left, they walked through the cemetery together, a ritual they had maintained for 7 years. The summer evening was warm, cicadas singing in the trees beyond the chapel. They stopped at Father Matthias's grave, where the wildflowers bloomed perennial and faithful. "Thank you," Sophie said quietly. Thomas looked at his daughter, seeing not the frightened 9-year-old from 7 years ago but the young woman who had learned that security came through generosity, that legacy was built through choices, that sometimes the best thing you could inherit was someone else's unfinished work. "For what?" Thomas asked. "For not giving up when Mom left. For buying this place even though it seemed impossible. For sharing the money when you could have kept it all. For teaching me that having enough means helping others get enough too." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I learned that from Father Matthias. And from you, actually. You were the one who said we should help people because he helped people like us." Sophie smiled. "I was 9. I didn't know what I was saying." "You knew exactly what you were saying," Thomas corrected. "Children understand fairness before they learn all the reasons adults use to justify selfishness." They stood together as darkness settled, father and daughter who had survived loss and found purpose, who had inherited more than property and built more than shelter. The chapel glowed behind them, its windows lit from within, hosting an AA meeting in the sanctuary where Father Matthias had once preached sermons about compassion and sacrifice. The next morning, Thomas drove Sophie to St. Louis, helped her move into her dormitory, hugged her goodbye with the understanding that she was leaving but not lost. She would visit. She would call. She would carry forward into architecture the lessons learned in an abandoned chapel, the understanding that buildings were more than structures, that spaces could serve purposes beyond their original design, that sometimes the best way to honor the past was transforming it into a future it could never have predicted. Thomas drove back to Clearwater alone, the truck cab feeling vast without Sophie's presence. But he didn't feel empty. He felt lightened, as if raising his daughter successfully had removed weight he hadn't known he was carrying. She would build things. She would create spaces that mattered. She would carry forward Father Matthias's legacy in forms the old priest could never have imagined. Autumn came to Missouri with its particular golden light, harvest time when the land revealed what a year of work had produced. Thomas stood in the cemetery pulling weeds, the same meditative work he had done for 7 years, connecting himself to earth and memory in the patient work of maintenance. The headstones stood witness to generations who had worked this soil, struggled with this land, built lives that ended but continued through children and choices and the simple fact of having existed. Margaret called on a Tuesday afternoon in October. "Thomas," she said, her voice carrying news. The diocese wants to commission a formal memorial for Father Matthias. A statue in front of the cathedral in Jefferson City, acknowledging his service. They want family input on the design. Thomas sat down slowly, processing this news. 7 years ago, Father Matthias had been condemned, erased, buried in unconsecrated ground. Now the institution that destroyed him wanted to memorialize him. The irony was sharp enough to cut. "What do you think?" Thomas asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I think institutions move slowly toward justice. I think recognition after death is better than continued condemnation. I think Father Matthias would find it funny that the Church is finally acknowledging what he did after 70 years of calling him a criminal. Will you help design it?" "I will," Margaret said. "With Sophie's input, if she's willing. I think Father Matthias would appreciate having a young architect involved in how he's remembered." Sophie, when Thomas called to tell her, agreed immediately. She started sketching concepts that week, designs that showed Father Matthias not in formal clerical robes but in work clothes, shirt sleeves rolled up, hands open in offering. Not a distant saint but a man who had worked alongside the people he served. The statue was unveiled the following spring, a bronze figure that stood 7 feet tall in front of Jefferson City's cathedral. The inscription read, "Father Matthias Blackwell, 1891–1962. He served those in need with everything he had, including his reputation. May we all have such courage." Thomas attended the ceremony with Margaret and Sophie, standing in a crowd of several hundred people. Descendants of families Father Matthias had helped, current foundation recipients, community members from Clearwater who had seen what his hidden legacy had created. The cathedral's archbishop spoke about institutional humility, about the Church's slow learning, about the difference between following rules and serving people. But it was Margaret who spoke last, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "My great-uncle died believing he had failed. He died condemned by the institution he served, separated from the community he loved. He never knew that his work would continue, that his hidden resources would eventually help thousands of families, that his name would be restored and his legacy honored. He died with faith that eventually, somehow, the truth would survive. Today proves he was right to have that faith." The crowd dispersed slowly, people lingering to touch the statue's bronze hands, to read the inscription, to remember. Thomas stood with Sophie and Margaret, 3 people connected by a dead priest's complicated legacy, by choices made in desperation and desperation transformed into purpose. The drive back to Clearwater took 2 hours through Missouri countryside washed in spring green. Thomas drove in comfortable silence, Sophie in the passenger seat sketching in her ever-present notebook, Margaret in the back reviewing foundation applications on her tablet. They were family, not through blood but through shared work, through understanding that legacy meant continuing what mattered beyond personal comfort. That evening, Thomas stood alone in the sanctuary as sunset light streamed through stained glass windows, casting colors across the wooden pews. 7 years had passed since he signed inheritance papers in desperate poverty. 7 years of renovation and foundation work in raising a daughter and honoring a dead priest's unfinished mission. The chapel was no longer abandoned. It was alive, serving purposes both familiar and new, carrying forward traditions while creating spaces for contemporary needs. He thought about Father Matthias sometimes, wondered what the old priest would say if he could see what his hidden chamber had created. Would he approve of the compromises, the fact that Thomas had kept half? Would he understand that sometimes practical help mattered more than absolute sacrifice? Thomas would never know. But he had Sophie's clarity to guide him, and Margaret's dedication, and Robert Fisher's journal documenting that helping people was never wrong even when institutions called it criminal. The Missouri evening settled over Clearwater, vast and gentle. Somewhere across darkening fields, families worked land they had nearly lost, saved by foundation loans that asked nothing except that they keep trying. Somewhere children slept in homes kept secure through emergency funds that prevented foreclosure. Somewhere people gathered in spaces like this chapel, finding community in buildings that served purposes beyond their original design. Thomas locked the chapel doors and climbed the stairs to his apartment, smaller now with Sophie away at college, but still home. Tomorrow would bring foundation work and renovation projects and the patient labor of maintaining a building that required constant attention. Tomorrow would be ordinary, and that was everything. Father Matthias hadn't hidden his wealth for grand dramatic gestures. He had hidden it so that someday, someone desperate enough to understand would find it and continue the work of making ordinary life possible for people who could no longer afford it. The land remembered everything. The cemetery held generations who had struggled and survived. The chapel stood on foundations laid by German settlers who had believed that sacred spaces should serve communities. Father Matthias's bones rested in soil that had forgiven him even when institutions wouldn't. And Thomas Brennan, a single father who had bought an abandoned chapel for back taxes and found a fortune hidden beneath its altar, slept in rooms renovated through desperate choices and difficult compromises, knowing he had done his best with impossible situations and that his best had been enough. Legacy wasn't something you built intentionally. It was what remained after you made choices that honored both survival and service, self-interest and sacrifice, the understanding that sometimes wisdom meant finding balance between competing needs rather than choosing absolute positions. Father Matthias had understood that. Thomas had learned it. Sophie would carry it forward. And the chapel, solid on its foundation, would stand witness to generations yet unborn, offering shelter and space and the possibility that even abandoned places could be redeemed through work and faith and the willingness to share unexpected blessings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.